right. I'll just give everybody a minute or two to get in because there's actually a bit of a delay. Somebody just asked, is it starting now? So yes, there it is. Thank you for your question. All right. So thank you everyone who's attending today's Google Hangout with the Canadian Energy Literacy Network run by the Canada Science and Technology Museum. These webinars are part of a series that happens the last Thursday of every month. And it's really for people who have an interest in energy literacy and who teach energy matters to other students, the general public, maybe their college or their university groups. And as always, we encourage viewers to get involved in the discussion and to ask questions along the side. Today we're going to have the privilege of hearing from a newly formed organization called CanCORE. It's the Canadian Council for Renewable Electricity. Formed just this year, the group is main goal is to educate and engage Canadians on the topic of expanded renewable electrical generation. We have 4 association heads with us today: Jacob Irving with the Canadian Hydropower Association, Howard Hornham with the Canadian Wind Energy Association, John Gorman with the Canadian Solar Industry Association, and Lisa Oberman from Marine Renewables Canada. As always, comme toujours, si vous avez des questions en français, tu peux demander ou écrire vos questions en français sur le côté. On va essayer de répondre dans la langue de votre choix, ou moi je vais faire une traduction. So as I'm saying, please ask questions in the language of your choice. In the interest of getting going, I'm going to pass it over to Jacob Irving and ask him to start with a bit of an introduction to the CHA as well as CanCORE. Take it away, Jacob.
Thanks very much, Jason, and thanks again to the Museum of Science and Technology for hosting this. I have the privilege of kicking things off a little bit and explaining the nature of the Canadian Council of Renewable Electricity. Jason provided a good overview of our mandate. But really, I think what we'd like to convey to everyone here today is that renewable electricity in Canada is big, it's growing, and it can grow even more. And we actually think that this is in the collective best interest of Canada, and dare we say it's even in the interest of North America and the world. Some interesting facts. We already have the cleanest and most renewable electricity system in the G7 group of countries. And in fact, Canada is one of the cleanest electricity systems in the world. We're 6th in the world in terms of renewable energy investment. So we're clearly engaged, and we clearly have a leadership position given our size and the nature of our country. We're also the 4th largest renewable energy capacity in the world. So when you take all of our different forms of energy together, hydro, wind, solar, the emerging marine renewables, kinetic, and when you put it all together, we're actually the 4th largest renewable energy system in the world. And when you think that we are a nation of 35 million people, we clearly box above our weight class in terms of what we're contributing on that front. And I think the good news is that we have abundant clean renewable energy resources across the country. Renewable electricity is truly a national resource. We have it from coast to coast to coast. We're a country that has a lot of water. We're a country that has strong wind patterns. We're a country that actually has a lot of sunlight, despite what you may think with winter coming on. And we have the world's longest coastline. So it stands to reason that we have a lot more that we can contribute here. So one of the questions is, how are we going to try and contribute? How are we going to try and grow this important resource even more than what we're doing today? One, of course, is the growth through investment in jobs. And then the other one, I think, is taking a leadership position in terms of climate change and greenhouse gas reductions. We think that both those key interests are in the interest of Canadians, and that's really what's going to help make sure that our technologies are unlocked to meet that end goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and fighting climate change. So what are we already seeing? We're already seeing that in 2014, Canada saw over $10 billion in renewable electricity projects. Again, sixth in the world with that kind of figure. And this was up 88% over 2013. So a huge amount of growth in just 1 year. Shows that we are growing, we're catching on, and that we're working off of our solid base. The next thing that we think is very important is that we want to help Canada decarbonize its electricity system, its overall energy system. Right now, the overall energy system in Canada, as large as our electricity is and as big as renewables are, we are still mostly using fossil fuels in our overall energy mix. We see an opportunity to electrify the end uses, bring on more electric vehicles, electric transportation in general, and then use the clean renewable electricity sources that we have and that we can build to further power that. That will reduce carbon emissions and help fight climate change. And we also have huge opportunities to export to the United States. A lot of people don't know is that the United States, much bigger electricity system, 10 times our population, but they're about 70% thermal fossil fuel emitting. So they have a huge emissions profile. Canada, by comparison, does not. And we have the ability to actually send some of our clean electricity their way to help them reduce their emissions. And so we'd actually reduce North American emissions and really start having a big impact on worldwide emissions as well. Canada has a real leadership role possibility there. And then, in terms of jobs and investment, this is the type of thing that we think Canadians should be excited about and that they should embrace, because it does mean a lot for our economy. There are some projections that talk about 620,000 person years of construction employment and 34,000 jobs in operations across our technologies by 2022. So we're already employing a lot of Canadians. We're already driving a huge part of the Canadian economy, and we know that we can do more. And again, we think that's in the interest of everyone. And I know that our group is actually authoring a paper where we're going to be talking about how we can reduce our emissions by 80% by 2050. And we think that that's a very strong objective to work backward from, and we think it's entirely achievable given our abilities combined as clean renewable electricity developers. The other thing that I think that we think is important too is from the research that we've done is, I said earlier, that we think that Canadians want this. We think that Canadians support this. We see that over 68% of Canadians believe that reaching environmental objectives and creating jobs and growing the economy are things that can all be done together. Few Canadians believe anymore that respecting the environment and growing the economy are mutually exclusive things. Most Canadians believe they can be done together, and our four technologies definitely see that, and we think we can prove that as well. We are proving it, in fact. And perhaps the other interesting thing that we see when we look at people's attitudes across the country is when we ask them, what is the #1 thing that governments could do to try and reduce greenhouse gases and fight climate change? The #1 action that shows up across the country, over 28% of Canadians say we need to turn on more renewable electricity. We're encouraged by that, obviously, and we hope that we can encourage Canadians too by telling them that we can meet that challenge, we can meet that goal. We have that ability, especially when we work together. So essentially for our four technologies, we participate in growing jobs, we participate in reducing greenhouse gases. We do it individually, but we can also do it collectively, and we can do it more and more collectively together. And that's really the purpose behind the Canadian Council on Renewable Electricity. As much as anything is to let Canadians know that we exist, that we're strong, we're growing, and we could and should grow more. And with a few more minutes, I'll just talk maybe a little bit about hydropower in particular. That's my organization. But I think in describing a little bit of who we are, what we do, it'll give a chance to the other forms of technology, wind, solar, and marine tidal kinetic, to talk about how they can contribute as well, how we're doing it together. Just a couple quick things about hydropower. I mean, we already talked about how large we are in clean renewable electricity overall. For hydropower in particular, again, this is a story about boxing above your weight class. Canadian Hydro, we are the 3rd largest generator in the world. And that's pretty significant when you think that first is China with about 1.6 billion people. Second is Brazil with 230 million people. Third is Canada with 35 million people. So we have a very strong hydro system that forms the majority of our generation. Basically, hydro is the #1 source of electricity in Canada. And that is fairly remarkable when you look at the way other countries develop and produce their electricity. We, for example, in the United States, we were just talking about, they have 70% thermal electricity. In Canada, we have 63% hydro. So again, it shows that we have an already cleaner system that can lend support. And just we were talking a little bit earlier about exports, and currently Canada is a net exporter of electricity to the United States. We send them more electricity than they send us. And about 80% of it is from clean renewable hydropower. So when we're sending electricity to the United States, in many cases, we're actually displacing some of their fossil fuel generation. And every time we do that, every time we send them a terawatt of electricity, we send them 40 terawatts a year, roughly. But every time we send them a terawatt, we're displacing about 500,000 and 1 million tons of CO2 every time we do that. So, you know, it's obviously in Canada's economic interest, and it's obviously in the United States' environmental interest for this relationship to grow. And the thing I always like to mention on this is, you know, as big as we are and as much as we're sending, it's a big deal to Canada, these exports. It's very important to us. Huge effect on our economy. In the United States, it's actually less than 1% of their overall consumption. So they're already bringing in a lot of clean renewable electricity from us, and it's a big deal to us, but to them, it's less than 1% of their overall consumption. And when you look at what they need to do to clean up their electricity system, there is clearly huge opportunity to grow these kinds of exports and to send more clean electrons down their way from hydropower, from wind, from solar, from marine as well. So we bend our mind to the positive on this. We think there's a lot of opportunity here because what we hear resoundingly from everyone on both sides of the border across the world, we need to clean up our electricity system as a planet, and we need to make it more clean and renewable. And the good news for Canada is that we already have huge capacity in that regard, and we have the ability to grow. On our hydropower producing, you know, we're the 3rd largest in the world, and we could still more than double our current installed capacity. And that is remarkable, and it's rare. Lots of very well-developed hydropower countries around the world don't have the same kind of undeveloped potential that we do as Canadians. So our technology has been around a long time, been around for 130 years, but we can still grow significantly. And we can grow in a way that is complementary with the other newer forms of renewable electricity that are coming on, wind, solar, marine, who I think you should get a chance to hear from now. And if that's all right, Jason, I'll pass it over to Robert, and he can talk a little bit about wind, if that works for everybody.
Hey, thank you very much, Jacob, and thanks as well to the museum for providing this opportunity. And I know these discussions are focused on energy literacy, and indeed electricity is something that's not particularly well understood in the country, and we have come together as CanCORE, the Council on Renewable Energy, because we think Canada has a particularly good story to tell, as Jacob described, but we also think that we're just at the beginning of writing that story, and that there's a lot more that can be done and will be done going forward to capitalize on Canada's tremendous renewable energy resources. My name's Robert Hornung. I work with the Canadian Wind Energy Association. We represent about 250 companies active in the Canadian wind energy market. And Canada has become a very significant market globally for wind energy. In the last 12 years, Canada has moved from about 300 megawatts of installed capacity to more than 10,000 megawatts, a level we passed this year. We are now the 7th largest wind energy producer in the world. And in the last 5 years, there's been more new wind energy capacity built in Canada than any other form of electricity generation. So what was really a marginal and niche technology just a decade ago is now clearly part of the mainstream. And there are a number of reasons for that. The first one is cost. For all of the technologies that we're discussing here, there's continual technological evolution and improvement that is driving costs down. Just in the last 5 years alone, the cost of wind energy has fallen by about 58%. And that's created a condition where in Canada today, the only source of electricity that you could argue would be cheaper than wind energy is natural gas. And that's only if you ignore the fact that there isn't a carbon price. If there was a carbon price on natural gas, it would be more expensive. And if you assume that natural gas will be at what are really historically low price levels today and will not fluctuate significantly going forward. And really, you can argue that wind energy is actually the most competitive source of electricity generation today in Canada. So we've been able to penetrate the market because of cost, clearly also because of the environmental benefits that are shared across all of our technologies. Jacob spent a lot of time speaking to climate. Right now you have jurisdictions in Canada that have phased out coal generation like Ontario, or that are considering moving more rapidly to do that, is in Alberta. And in those jurisdictions, you are either going to replace that generation with natural gas or with renewables. And at the end of the day, if you replace coal with natural gas, you get a short-term benefit in terms of the climate, but you don't get a long-term benefit, because as electricity demand grows and you bring more gas on, your emissions go back up again. So the only way to ensure sustained long-term greenhouse gas emission reductions is through increasing the use of renewables. And as Jacob mentioned, ultimately, if you want to get down to what scientists say is required in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions, levels of reductions from today's levels of 80% by 2050, you can only do that through massive electrification. Electrification of transportation, of heating and cooling systems, of industrial processes. And that only works if that electricity is non-greenhouse gas emitting. And that's where renewables have a very important role to play going forward. And that's why you see globally, in 2014, for the first time ever, you saw more investment in renewable energy electricity generation than in fossil fuel electricity generation. Between 2015 and 2020, the International Energy Agency expects that 65 or 2/3 of investment in electricity generation is going to be in renewable energy generation. And this is being driven by improved costs, it's being driven by environmental performance, because it's not just climate change, there's no air pollution associated with technologies like wind, solar, hydro. You also do not have waste products, toxic or otherwise, that are helping to create these opportunities. It's also a significant economic opportunity. I mean, each technology is different, but for example, with wind, you build wind farms in rural areas. And rural areas are areas that are often highly dependent on a commodity-based economy. Perhaps it's farming, perhaps it's fisheries, perhaps it's forestry. Wind is another natural resource that these economies, rural economies, can utilize to grow and diversify their economy. And there are many, many rural communities now across the country that are getting a significant portion of their economic development and resources from exploitation of wind energy and other renewable energy resources. So these factors are what are driving the rapid growth in renewables that we see in Canada and around the world. And just to give you a sense of how we've only really scratched the surface of the potential still in Canada, Jacob mentioned the massive hydroelectric potential that is undeveloped. In Canada, you can easily argue that Canada has more wind energy potential than it could ever hope to use, because it exceeds our electricity demand significantly. And at this point in time, we see 4% of Canada's electricity coming from wind. But if we look around the world, we see countries like Denmark where we're up to 40%, or Germany where we're at almost 20%. There are even 9 US states that get between 10 and 30% of their electricity from wind energy today. So Canada is still at an early stage in the process, but has tremendous resources to grow that going forward. One of the reasons why CanCORE as an organization is so important is because moving towards a future where electricity systems are built primarily around renewable energy is possible because of the synergies that exist between renewable energy technologies. So for example, wind is a variable source of electricity generation. The amount you produce varies with the amount of wind. So it does need to be partnered with other technologies. And a technology like hydro is a perfect partner. It can serve as a great storage and almost like a battery that you can use to store energy when wind is blowing, and then release that energy by letting water through a dam when the wind is not blowing. It's a great partnership. Wind and solar have a tremendous complementarity in the sense that wind energy production in Canada peaks in the nighttime and peaks in the winter. Solar energy production peaks in the summer and peaks in the daytime. and together they can provide a more constant source of electricity for Canadians. And even with marine technologies, we're seeing that, for example, wind energy in Europe, where we have much higher penetrations and extensive wind energy facilities on land, there's now extensive development of wind energy offshore. And many of the technologies and challenges that wind is facing are technologies and challenges that marine technologies are also going to have to work with, and challenges that they will also have to address. And there's a tremendous amount of synergy to work together to address those challenges, to capture that opportunity. So at the end of the day, we think, as I said at the start, renewable energy is a great untold story in Canada, but it's a story which we've really only started to build on, and there's so much potential that's as yet untapped. That's the story we want to tell Canadians. And I will move from wind over to solar and ask John to offer some reflections on that.
Thank you very much, Robert, and my thanks as well to the museum for helping us host this today. It's an interesting conversation. I think one of the benefits here of going third down the line is that Jacob and Robert have already covered a great deal of the ground in terms of what we're trying to accomplish by coming together under the CanCORE umbrella. And so I think I'll take a little bit of a different tact and maybe talk about the global electricity system before bringing it back here to Canada. First, let me say that my name is John Gorman, and I am the president of the Canadian Solar Industries Association. We represent about 250 companies across Canada who are engaged in all parts of making a solar installation, a solar electricity generating plant happen, whether that's on the roof of a person's home or a large company or in very large installations in fields. We work to ensure that there's good policy and sustainable policy support for introducing solar electricity into Canada's electricity grid. Now, on that sort of policy note and the idea of bringing in renewable electricity into the market, I just want to take a step back and say this. You know, the global electricity system is undergoing massive change right now. So essentially, about 130 years ago, the very first real utility scale power producers were established, and they have a certain model that has been in place for about 130 years, and that model simply has been build as big a plant as possible using the cheapest possible fuel, create as many electrons as possible, and force them down smaller and smaller wires until they are forced into the home or business of a captive consumer. That is the way that the electricity system has worked up until very recently. And that would have been fine if all regions around the world were blessed with the hydro resources that we have here in Canada. You know, a clean, centralized source of electricity that doesn't emit. But the fact is, on a global scale, that has been primarily dominated by building very large fossil fuel plants in these centralized ways. And it's the reason why 40% of all GHGs emitted into the air globally right now come from creating electricity from fossil fuel sources. So there's a big change happening globally right now because of some of the pressures, climate imperatives, and global efforts to reduce reductions that Jacob and Robert have spoken to. And that is that nations around the world are subbing out those centralized carbon fuel-based plants and replacing them with renewable sources of electricity. And as this is a very large movement now, as Robert noted, investment in bringing in new renewable electricity sources has recently outpaced investment in bringing in fossil fuel generated electricity. So that is a major accomplishment. And we see that trend continuing. The International Energy Agency sees that trend continuing. And so you will, if you take, for example, last year, investments in renewable electricity were about $265 billion, ahead of fossil fuel electricity plants. And solar was the majority of that investment at about $150 billion. So this brings me to, I guess, my perspective here from the solar industry, and I'd like to try to impress upon all of you that solar electricity has moved well beyond being a science experiment and is now a mainstream electricity source. So we are part of this new global movement in terms of investing in renewable electricity, and in fact now we are the largest single share of that, and it reflects the amount of growth in the adoption of solar electricity around the world. The International Energy Agency predicts that solar electricity will in fact be the dominant source of electricity generation by 2050, and Citibank says that that's going to happen by 2040. So the adoption of solar is becoming is very aggressive around the world, and it has to do with the price drop. In the last 30 years, the price of solar electricity has dropped 99%. So, and in just the last 5 years alone, that price decrease has been increasing, and it decreased another 73% over the last 5 years. So very, very significant price reductions, along with this global movement to move to clean energy sources, is driving the massive adoption of solar electricity. The other thing I'd like to say about solar, and it's sort of in response to a question that is here on the screen, and it has to do with some of the unique aspects of solar. So as Robert was saying just before me, the thing that all electricity systems should be striving for is to try to find a balance of technologies on the system. The way that hydro and marine and wind and solar come together to form a whole that is stronger than its parts. And it has to do with the characteristics of the different types of renewable electricity and how they benefit the system. Solar has a very particular and unique aspect to it, and that is its ability to be very scalable. Unlike any other type of electricity technology, you can have solar PV running your calculator on your home, on your business, or in massive fields and in deserts, creating vast amounts of electricity. And almost everybody has access to the sun. Now, the interesting thing about that scalability is that within this umbrella of renewable electricity transforming markets, solar is allowing people, individuals, and smaller businesses and big businesses to be able to generate and manage their own electricity differently. And that's sort of a subplot that's happening in this great transformation of our electricity system globally, is the fact that people are able to put solar panels on their roof. And not only are they able to generate their own electricity, but they're now able to store that electricity in the Tesla Powerwall that's come onto the market, which is in their basement. And they're able to get a rebate on an electric vehicle that is parked in their driveway, which can also store electricity and send it back and forth to the grid. And they're able to pull up applications on their iPhone which allow them to look at how much energy they're generating and decide whether to use it in-house, store it, or send it back so that their neighbors and the utility can use it to the best advantage of the electricity grid to make it not only greener but more resilient. And so there's a bit of a subplot that's happening under this great transformation where the very distributed nature of solar is enabling all sorts of other technologies, empowering people and businesses, and fundamentally changing the way that we use, create, and manage electricity. It's really very, very similar to the way that the hardwired telephone transformed into the smartphone that we all use today. When you cut the wires, suddenly you're entering into a new era of empowerment. And that's a very important thing about solar energy to mention. So in conclusion, I'd just like to go back to CanCORE and the opportunity that we have here as Canadians to have a leadership position globally by virtue of the incredible water, wind, solar, and marine resources that we have. As Jacob mentioned, we are already the G7 leader in hydro, and hydroelectricity forms the backbone of what can be the cleanest electricity system in the world if we are determined to make the sort of policy changes we need to bring on more wind and bring on more solar and take advantage of our marine sources. This is a message that hasn't really been broadcasted to Canadians and even to the policymakers nationally. This idea that Canada already is in a position to be able to take 65% of its electricity from renewable sources, and if we turned our attention to it and go that last distance, we would be able to take advantage of the other incredible resources we have to have the cleanest electricity system in the world. And the advantage of having that very clean electricity system not only means the ability to participate in this $8 trillion market, which is happening over the next 25 years for clean electricity, but it means that we're going to be able to transform our other sectors, like the way that we heat our buildings and the way that we power our cars, and that's going to allow Canada to be a world leader in bringing down GHG emissions across all sectors. And so really the exciting prospect of what we're doing here with CanCORE is, for the first time, I believe, seeing the renewable energy sectors coming together and saying, there is a story here where Canada becomes a world leader in terms of transforming its electricity system and electrifying all different parts of its economy, all different sectors, so that we can become a world leader in reducing GHGs. And that's what we're here to do. So with that said, I'd like to pass it over to Elisa Oberman from the Marine Renewables Canada organization. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. And thank you again to the museum for the opportunity. It's great that we have this opportunity to kind of talk about CanCORE and also how all of our renewable energy resources can benefit Canadians and internationally as well. So a lot of ground has been covered. So I thought I'd just start off by talking a little bit about Marine Renewables Canada and who we are. Marine Renewable Energy is a fairly new resource compared to some of the others that have been talked about today. Our association, Marine Renewables Canada, is basically focused on advancing the sector and supporting our membership. We have a membership of about 100 companies, and they range from the device developers to project developers, utilities, and the marine and energy supply chain. So we work very closely with them to do things such as fostering collaboration among our membership, academia and government. We provide outreach and engagement activities. And then a big focus, and a little bit what I'm going to talk about today, is the business development side of things. So in our industry and in the renewable sector in general, there's a lot of opportunity in trade and export internationally, and building the expertise here that can be exported internationally. So that's a big focus for us, as well as looking for those opportunities. So in terms of marine renewables, our focus is on wave and tidal energy and also river current. So when I say river current, we're looking at some of those smaller scale applications that use hydrokinetic devices. So that's essentially devices that use turbines in rivers and in tidal. And we see marine renewables as a very beneficial resource for Canada, and part of the energy mix that can be brought to Canadians in the future. And so we look at it as something that can help diversify the current electricity mix in Canada. And one of the reasons for that is that there's abundant resources, just like we're seeing in solar, wind, and hydro. There's also a lot of marine renewable resources. So across the country, we have river almost in every province, and there's a lot of opportunity there. We also have tidal energy opportunities in different areas of the country. So in British Columbia, there's potential. And then, of course, we have the Bay of Fundy, which is recognized as a first-class resource and is attracting a lot of global attention and international investment to Canada. And then also we have wave energy on both coasts that presents a lot of potential as well. So we're also focused on marine renewables because there is a growing global market, and it's a new and emerging market that provides a lot of potential for these trade and export opportunities. So we look at developing the industry in Canada as an opportunity to develop our skills, our expertise, new technologies and solutions that can be exported to places like the UK, France, Ireland, and some of the other emerging markets where marine renewables is starting to become something that's really being realized more for what the potential opportunity could be. And then similar to what Robert mentioned, a lot of these, where projects would happen in Canada are in rural locations, remote communities, northern communities, where there is a need to offset expensive diesel. And so we see that as an opportunity for communities to get involved. There's ownership opportunities in these projects, and there's also a lot of economic opportunity, again, like I said, in being part of the supply chain that starts to work on these projects, because for a lot of these projects, about 70% of the project costs or project requirements would require local expertise. So that's a huge opportunity for Canadian firms and researchers to get involved. So I guess I'm just going to kind of wrap up a little bit on, I think that we as an association are really looking at CanCORE as a way that we can work together with the other renewable electricity associations as a collective, because we know that this is really an opportunity to bring on more renewable electricity, and working together, we do have common interests and goals just to see the Canadian electricity mix become cleaner and on a path to decarbonization. So I will leave it at that and pass it on to Jason. Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone for your insights. We have a couple of questions on the side, so I'm just going to read them out so that everyone is aware of what they are. And John began addressing one of them during his presentation, so maybe I'll see if anybody else wants to add to it. The question was, I perceive a gap between the available energy choices the panel is speaking to and the choices that individual consumers can make. Can you speak to that gap and how individuals can increase their power or ability to make positive choices? And so I guess John was talking about that decentralized nature of solar and how people can install these. Is there ways, though, that these other larger projects, people can still get involved with that, or feel that their choices will affect how those projects go forward? Anyone want to address that?
I can take a quick stab at that, Jason. It's Robert Hornung here. I would highlight a couple of points. John mentioned the scalability of solar, and that's true of many renewable technologies. Even hydro, you can have huge mega dams and run-of-river projects. And that means that you can have a broad range of different ownership structures. And if, for example, we look across Canada in the wind sphere, which I'm most familiar with, we have wind energy projects that are owned by First Nations. We have wind energy projects that have large equity stakes from municipal governments. We have small wind energy projects that are owned by community groups. So there's a wide range of potential ownership structures there. There also are smaller distributed scale wind energy technologies as well. And you will see them used, for example, at cottages or in remote communities or at commercial facilities. Or, for example, at the avec diamond mine in the Northwest Territories, there's a 9-megawatt wind farm which is helping to offset the use of diesel at that facility. So that scalability that John touched on is not only important because it allows you to build new generation so it more closely aligns with changes in demand, but it also opens up the door to much broader range of potential roles for participation for individuals and communities. And I think that's one of the real strengths of renewable energy relative to some of the conventional technologies.
I think I can build on that too, Jason. From a hydro perspective, it's true. I mean, it's not everyone who can build a hydro facility in their backyard. Compared to solar, you can go and get yourself a panel and install it. So it just speaks to the diversity of our different forms of generation. But for hydro, I think, at the local community level where we build our projects, we've had a lot of growth in community participation and partnership. And in fact, a lot of our projects are built in Aboriginal communities. And over time, we've seen very progressive relationships in that regard. We have partnerships with Aboriginal communities on some of our projects. We have enhanced benefit sharing agreements throughout. And so a lot of Aboriginal communities have really taken the opportunity to build hydro within their territories and maximize benefits. And that's the type of participation that I think we see primarily in our industry. I think the other thing I could say is that, if you're asking what can you as a consumer, as a citizen, do to try and help bring on more clean renewable electricity of all different types. Yes, you can buy solar panels at the individual level, but at a bigger level, supporting a price on carbon and supporting action on climate change is good for all renewables. We all play very well in that space. We all are part of that solution. And so supporting our new federal government in trying to adopt a price on carbon is the kind of thing that you as an individual can do to really help unlock all of us, because that kind of broad-based change is good for all renewables, and again, we think is in the interest of all Canadians.
I'll add one last leg to this stool that Robert and Jacob have started building here. And that has to do with innovative financing opportunities that are coming to the forefront now around renewable energies. Again, just speaking globally, the global market, there's an entrenched financing system in place that has built up all sorts of innovative and sometimes favorable treatment for fossil fuels. All of our associations are working on ensuring that there's equal treatment in terms of tax breaks and other things for fuels to try to bring more renewables into the mix. And part of that effort has also been the entry of microfinancing opportunities and green bonds and other community-based financing opportunities that individuals can actually invest in and participate in a much bigger pool that is funding renewable energy. And I would encourage the questioner to look into those options from a financing perspective as well. And lastly, we have been seeing the emergence of clean electricity retailers. So I think Bullfrog Power is the one that jumps to my mind, and it's the fact that the one that we use here to power our operations at CanCEA. But these are retailers who go out and buy clean electricity, whether it comes from hydro or wind or solar or other forms of clean electricity, and essentially supports them when they deliver electricity to the individual consumer or business. And I think that's a worthwhile thing to look at as well.
All right, thank you. So I think that really answers it well for everything from installing your own smaller generation to supporting carbon pricing to investing opportunities. So it seems like there's actually quite a bit. The next question here we'll address says, wonderful that CanCORE can work to clean up North America. How can Canada work to reduce its economic need on fossil fuel exports overseas? So if I could just take one small bit about that as well. I know that when we think of fossil fuel exports, it definitely brings a lot of economic benefits, but also some of those exports are going to countries where they're still experiencing energy poverty, which is something we don't have here in Canada. So I think that there is that need for balancing those exports to places that actually do need energy. But do anybody here on the panel see how what any role for CanCORE of reducing the need for fossil fuel exports overseas?
I can go first. I think it's important to make a clear distinction between electricity generation and fossil fuel exports, I guess, which is the question here. Generally speaking, especially in most jurisdictions around the world, and in Canada, a very, very, very small percentage of the electricity that is produced comes from oil. You know, those sort of diesel generating systems. So I just kind of want to make that distinction. But I think where the potential to reduce dependence on fossil fuels generally comes from is in this idea that Canada takes advantage of its vast renewable electricity resources and electrifies as many sectors as it can. And so I'm going to use, for example, the transportation, the light vehicle transportation sector, you know, passenger vehicles. We're seeing the emergence of hybrid vehicles and now the emergence of completely electric vehicles, and this transition away from gasoline-driven cars. When you clean up your electricity system and with renewable electricity, it really empowers you to be able to start focusing on the other sectors that are emitting GHGs and using fossil fuel to do that, like the transportation sector. And that's why you know, one of the things that you'll see supported by CanCORE and its individual members is this idea that we should push to electrify as many of the Canadian sectors as we can in order to reduce emissions, and of course, to be able to do that, you have to have a clean electricity system. So I hope that answers or partially answers your question.
And I think I can build on that, John, too. When you're talking about electrifying transportation, this is a kind of a Canada could lead by example. We looked at it, electric vehicles, light-duty vehicles like you're talking about, John, the commuter vehicles that we all drive. We looked at the entire fleet across North America and we said, what if we plugged in some of the undeveloped Canadian hydropower potential into fueling those vehicles? What if we converted our light-duty vehicles over to electric or electric hybrids? And we found some pretty interesting results. If we took just half of the undeveloped hydro that exists in Canada and we dedicated it to electrifying personal vehicles, we'd be able to do the entire Canadian fleet, every car in Canada, the current fleet. And we'd be able to do about 25% of the US fleet, which we know is much bigger. And I think that that's a fairly hopeful message, in the sense that, you know, if you're excited about electric vehicles coming on and all the emission reductions that they offer, you know that they have to plug into a clean and renewable electricity source for them to realize their full benefit. And then the question you want to ask yourself is, well, okay, that's great, but do we have enough clean renewable electricity to underwrite this kind of change? And what we found from the hydro perspective in Canada, we have more than enough just hydro to electrify the entire Canadian fleet. And in fact, each province has enough hydro within its borders to do its own provincial fleet. Now you add wind, solar, marine to it, we can keep growing, and then all of a sudden that 25% of vehicles in the United States could grow even more. And so if you rally around electrifying our energy system and using more electricity and less fossil fuels, that's how you get to the sort of change that I think the question was picking at. And so all of us together, I mean, again, just based on sort of hydro alone and then all the other renewables alongside, we should be excited about electrifying our vehicle fleet in Canada. I sometimes joke, I say, you know, if electric vehicles ran on banana peels, it might not be in Canada's interest to support them. We don't grow bananas here. But they do work best on clean, renewable electricity. And we have that en masse across the country. And we have the ability to build even more, and in fact, electrify our own fleet and help the Americans electrify their fleet as well. That's real change that we together can really help underwrite.
And Jason, I might just add one more comment just to say that obviously in terms of our ability and capacity to export clean electricity, you're limited by the fact that you need to transmit it, and by transmission and other requirements. And therefore, when we're looking at countries outside of North America, we are not a solutions provider in that sense. But we can be a solutions provider in terms of providing knowledge, expertise, and skills to other countries to help them capitalize on their renewable energy resources. And Canadian hydro companies have been doing that for a very long time around the world. We have Canadian wind energy companies that are particularly active in the Caribbean, working with local governments and utilities to help capitalize on those resources. So there are definitely opportunities for Canada to play a much broader role than simply operating in the North American space.
Yeah, on that note, actually, I was going to ask Lisa, can you speak to tidal, because you mentioned the Bay of Fundy and a huge coastline here. What kind of role can Canada play in helping develop that marine technology globally?
Well, that's one of the areas, we focus on quite a bit. So the way I kind of describe it is, because Canada has such great resources in tidal particularly, we kind of look at it as these first projects here, the resources are kind of our lab to start developing these technologies and innovations that are needed everywhere in the world. And a lot of the reasoning for that is because every place you look at that's working on developing marine renewable energy has the same challenges as us. And a lot of the challenges is just working in these harsh environments, getting the technologies to work in kind of cold, harsh, energetic water. And so we really can work on that by developing the projects here domestically, and then again exporting our expertise and skills to those other countries. And one thing I should point out too is, there are very large markets developing in the UK and France for marine energy, but there's a lot of other smaller regions and island nations that can also use marine renewables. So that's another opportunity as well.
Okay, thanks. We have a question here that's specifically to John. I'll read it out so everyone can hear it. To what extent do you see the potential for distributed solar to disrupt the centralized fossil-based utilities in provinces such as Nova Scotia, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, as we've seen in other jurisdictions such as California?
Thank you for the question, James. So the short answer is distributed solar, and especially the scale-up solar that we're talking about on people's houses and on top of their businesses, is going to be I believe it's going to be a driving force in transforming the electricity systems away from coal, especially in those markets that you mentioned, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Nova Scotia. And I'm going to speak to that. However, I just want to take a step back first and talk about Alberta, which is really an area a jurisdiction that is taking a very serious look at phasing out its coal-fired electricity in a fashion similar to what Ontario has done. So in Alberta, they recognize that they want to achieve some very significant GHG emission reductions. They see the electricity sector as low-hanging fruit because they have about almost 2/3 of their electricity consumed coming from coal-fired electricity, and by extension, that means that Alberta alone is responsible for more than 50% of Canada's emissions from electricity generation. So they've set this new government in particular set very aggressive goals for climate policy renewal and for curbing their GHG reductions and showing leadership, and they see the phase out of coal as being a way to do that, and they're taking a serious look at it. And our associations are in active dialogue with them about how to use renewable energy to replace coal. So all of that to say on this first point that solar electricity in and of itself is not going to be the best solution for replacing coal. It has to be done in conjunction with other renewable energy sources. Going back to what Robert Hornung was saying about the way the technologies work together and complement each other, Alberta, we've been encouraging Alberta to look at a solution that brings on the right amount of each renewable energy source so that they've got a very resilient, cost-effective, balanced system that is able to take the place of coal. So I'll say that first of all. But then getting to the sort of disruptive side of solar, solar is disruptive in the sense that it is empowering consumers and enabling them to generate electricity in a very distributed way. And when you have consumers becoming empowered like that, generating, managing, controlling their own electricity, not only are they tapping into their own behaviors around wanting to have a positive impact on climate change, but they are actually participating in the system and understanding it. And it's those people who are realizing that not only are they becoming empowered and able to save money on their electricity, but they're doing something that's favorable to the environment, and that creates a sort of public support that is broadly needed for phasing out coal-fired electricity and bringing in renewables. So on that level, I see solar as being disruptive because it's able to bring essentially voters into the equation when it comes to participating in a clean energy future.
All right, great. We're getting low on time here, but there's a new question that's come up. I think it's really quite relevant to this, and there's quite a bit of science behind this. It runs, I've heard that to take full advantage of a decentralized small-scale renewable energy mix being put into the grid, we need to have to upgrade the grid. So what does that entail? I think it's addressing that idea of the smart grid.
Well, I think, would you like me to answer that, Jason, or hand it over to someone else on the panel? I can take a first stab anyway.
Go for it.
I want to say this. I don't agree with, first of all, I don't think it's correct to say that bringing on renewables means sort of redundant investment. In fact, I'd argue the opposite. Renewable energies are scalable at different levels. And I'm gonna focus here on wind and solar a little bit. But the fact that you can build scalable electricity systems close to where electricity is needed, whether it's on your home or it's just outside of your municipality, sort of producing power at the size that you want it, actually means you get to defer investments or avoid investments in very centralized, old school technologies and transmission lines and substations and things like that. So just from a sort of infrastructure investment point of view, the scalability of renewable energy, in particular wind and solar, allows you to make smart decisions about where you are generating your electricity, and allows you to avoid investments that would otherwise be needed to support a centralized system.
If you don't mind, too, I wouldn't mind mentioning from a hydro perspective that Canada has a hydropower backbone, which is impressive and important when you're talking about clean, renewable electricity. So when you bring on the newer forms, such as wind and solar, in Canada, you're able to graft those new technologies onto a hydropower backbone, which allows for a greater adoption of them. The one thing about hydro that no one's ever beaten us on in our 130 years of history is that we are the most dispatchable form of electricity generation, which means that you can turn us on and off faster than anyone else. And it stands to reason when you think about it. You open the gate, water rushes through a turbine, you're making electricity almost instantly. You close the gate, you stop making electricity almost instantly. And it's very important to have a nimble and fluid backbone to enable the newer kinds of disruptive technologies, as solar and the like, to be able to successfully integrate and to come onto the grid. So that's a huge strength that Canada has. We have a strong hydro backbone to enable this sort of thing, and by all of us working together, we'll grow each other, I think, to meet the collective demand of nations.
I'd like to agree with that and make a distinction around something. There is this other, when the question came up earlier about solar being disruptive, there is solar is being disruptive globally in terms of creating distributed smart generation that is essentially disrupting the old model of centralized electricity production. And in developing countries where there is no centralized grid, sometimes they're finding it makes sense to have these very distributed systems and not have all of those wires in the first place. It's like going straight to cell phones. But in developed countries like Canada, and I would say in particular in Canada, because of our amazing hydro backbone, we have in many jurisdictions across the country a very, very clean backbone, and it wouldn't be the best use of our existing infrastructure for distributed generation to be replacing the clean electricity. And so the proposition for distributed generation in Canada is not about replacing existing infrastructure. It's about complementing it, as Jacob said. And the idea isn't to try to get homes and businesses, in solar's case, off of the grid. The objective is to create many smart generating stations that are attached to the main grid, so that communication can go back and forth between the house and the business and the main electricity system to enable the utilities to be able to control the electricity to everybody's cost benefit, and to make the systems more resilient in terms of being able to be smart about how they shift electricity around. So our objective in industrialized countries that have clean systems is to complement the existing system. But of course, what you want is for that existing system to be as clean as possible, and that's what CanCORE is looking to promote.
All right, I'm going to ask. We're kind of right at the edge of time here, but we had a final question, and then we'll wrap it up. As consumers, we've been prodded to be more energy efficient in the home to the point where local utilities are having financial difficulties in collecting sufficient funds to maintain these systems. Aside from raising prices, how can utilities continue? Does anyone want to take a stab at that?
I think this is again driven by this this idea of distributed generation being very disruptive to utilities, to the old school model of utilities producing and delivering electrons to make money. I mean, the utility model for 130 years has been based on that idea, right? The only product that they produce and sell is an electron, and that is coming into conflict with today's expectations from consumers and the expectations certainly from a climate policy point of view. It's clearly no longer good enough to build a massive coal plant and try to deliver as many electrons as you can. We're trying to clean up the electricity generation sources, and we're trying to encourage people to use less electricity. So as a utility in that old paradigm, what do you do when some regulator comes to you and says, I'd like you to stop producing and distributing as much of the only product that you make and sell as you can? It's counterproductive and it's counterintuitive. But I would say this: those utilities are going to have to change their business model, and we're seeing examples of that all over the world right now. It's just that business model no longer works in this new policy context, and it doesn't work for the consumers and their demands around how they want to generate and manage electricity and what type of electricity they want. So yes, the utilities are going to have to go through an evolution here to change their business model, to create greener electricity, and to react to more sophisticated demands by consumers. And I would again just point you back to the telecommunications world, where the monopolies of the world, owned all of the wires, and your only option as a consumer of a telephone company was to be able to pick up or put down your telephone to speak to a particular individual. Now, only 3 decades later, we find that the consumer has complete control over producing content, delivering it, doing it wirelessly over our smartphones, and the utilities have been able to adapt to that new paradigm and in many cases be making more money out of these value-added services. And that's the sort of mentality that the leading utilities around the world are taking right now when they look at changing the way that they interact with their consumers on electricity.
And I would just add quickly to say that I think all of us would agree that the first step that we would want to pursue from an environmental or an economic perspective in regard to electricity is to encourage efficient electricity use. That's where you're going to minimize environmental impacts and minimize economic costs. Electricity, though, is in a very fortunate position at this time in that we need to strive for that efficiency, but we also, to address the challenges we have in front of us, also need to increase electrification. And we want to use more electricity going forward in the most efficient manner possible. And at the end of the day, utilities have to make a transition, and the policy frameworks that support them have to make a transition to recognize that utilities are not really, as John said, providing electrons. Utilities are providing energy services. And at the end of the day, their objective will ultimately have to become how to provide those energy services in the most efficient and cost-effective and environmentally friendly way possible.
I might just add that energy efficiency is top of mind for everyone. The less energy you use, the more efficient you become, the better it is in terms of economics and the environment in general. But what we're looking at in Canada and across North America is a change to our system. You look at the United States, over 70% fossil emitting and emitting. You know, energy efficiency is going to play a big role there. But ultimately, at some point, you're going to have to replace out that fossil burning system with something that's cleaner and more renewable. So even if we don't grow the demand for electricity across North America, across Canada, we're going to have a lot of work to do just to change out the existing system that's in place in order to clean up our emissions and to lead the world as the world expects us to lead.
Great. Well, we've run out of time here, but thank you, everybody, for those words. That was really interesting. Big thank you, of course, to the presenters and for everybody who tuned in and who asked questions. It's really great to have so many people participating in the conversation. Next month, we will be having our webinar on November 26th, same time. It'll also be the last Hangout that we'll be doing for the 2015 season, as we won't be doing one in December. We're just finalizing our topic right now, so stay tuned for an update. And we will be continuing these sessions into 2016. So anybody who's watching, if you would like to present to this group, or if you have a suggestion for a topic that you'd like us to find some presenters on, please send us a note. You can find us through our website, which is letstalkenergy.ca, or you can tweet us with the hashtag TalkEnergy, and our handle is @EnerTweets. So I'll thank again all of our presenters. That was really great. And I hope everyone has a great Halloween and is safe over the weekend.
Thank you. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.